Good afternoon. I'll call to order the working group to examine the taxation of federally recognized tribal nations for our Monday, December 11, 2023 meeting. We have a relatively short agenda, although that may or may not foretell how long the meeting will go, but we'll see what happens. I guess the first item on our agenda is to approve the minutes from the November 14 meeting. You have in your packet from our able administrators of the draft minutes. Is there any discussion or questions or corrections to the minutes?
Motion to approve.
I have a motion to approve the minutes, seconded by Representative Nuccio. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion carries. Minutes are approved. We'll move into our agenda then, which is to discuss the proposed recommendations. We've been here for a few months, receiving quite a bit of information and becoming a bit more educated, at least I have been, about these issues. We have, all of us were asked to submit, well, those who cared to, submit proposed recommendations for consideration by the working group. We could go through them one by one, if that's all right with you, or have a general discussion. Any questions? We could just start. So I submitted in your packet, I think you should see a little memo from me to the group, draft recommendations for consideration. They were submitted on the 1st, so I won't go through and read it to you, but I have learned quite a bit about this topic in the time spent with you all. And just to summarize some of the issues as indicated in my recommendations are that this issue of sovereignty and how the state deals with the sovereign nations within its borders is a function of federal law. The U.S. Congress has jurisdiction here, as does the federal courts. So that is another venue for resolution of these issues. My draft recommendations points that out. The draft recommendations also note that the two sovereign nations have different agendas, different points of view here. And I'm not sure there's a single solution that they agree on. So we point that out. And the memo also attempts to reduce to writing some of the observations I've made here in person, which is that I'm not sure about the precedent that we'd be setting with regard to our state tax policies if we were to advocate a change to the status quo at this time. I've also indicated that our state fiscal situation is somewhat in flux at the moment. We have reported to the General Assembly last week in our fiscal accountability report, as well as to the credit rating agencies the week before, that our revenue situation is changing as we move through time, and as we are seeing the federal funds that we were in receipt of are no longer in the size that we had them and seem to be going away. So we have a changing situation fiscally. So that's something we have to take account of, or at least I do as part of what we do at OPM. So I landed on simply recommending that we continue to study the issue, that we coordinate with our federal as well as tribal leaders to explore options that I would hope minimize any state revenue loss or require any additional expenditures by the state. That's where OPM left its recommendations, and I'll recognize Senator Austin.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Secretary, I've always had this concern relative to your comments on state tax policy. And concerning state tax policy, my understanding is with both tribal nations, both the federally recognized tribal nations, that there is an agreement with the administration relative to sales tax and income tax. And those agreements would have to be brought back up, and they have not been brought back up, but because they are an agreement, both of the tribal nations and the administration have that in writing already, so it would not impact either sales tax or income tax based on the fact that there is agreements with the parties. So I just wanted to say that mostly for the record, because we've talked about that amongst all of us here, and I've never really said that out loud, and I think that that needs to be part of the written record, that those tax policies are already decided. This is not one that has been decided.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask a quick follow-up question to that?
Representative Horn.
If I could just ask Senator Austin, is that agreement is written down so that it's clear on the record that the tribes have consented to that agreement?
I don't think that you could characterize it as a consent. There was an agreement between the parties. So both parties.
So they are a
had-
party to the agreement.
that they're party to the agreement.
Great.
There was not something that was done based on it in Attorney Conway.
I guess, oh, go ahead.
And I would just
Attorney Conway.
clarify that it's actually in the nature of it is a revenue ruling from the Department of Revenue Services. Both tribes worked with the department in the early 2000s and came to an agreement, but the form of it is not, all parties sign like the compact. The Department of Revenue Services of the state issued a revenue ruling saying, this is how we see sales and use tax. There were maybe 12 issues, and both tribes have lived under that revenue ruling since that time. We have a very good relationship with the Department of Revenue Services. Both tribes have worked whenever there's an issue that comes up that maybe isn't exactly addressed by it. We've gone to them and we've always come to an agreement on how to handle it. So there are certain things where tribal taxes are collected and only tribal taxes are collected. And then there's other things where only state taxes are collected. And we've been operating under that since 2001, I believe, or 2002.
If I could follow up, I guess my question is how to differentiate this agreement, the revenue agreement, from, say, a court case like the Second Circuit decision, to which there are, of course, you are party to it, but you may disagree with the resolution of the case and pursue other alternatives to change that, legitimate alternatives. So you have, say, take the Second Circuit case here. It is, a legitimate ruling, and everyone has lived according to that. No one is and as I understand it, no one is in violation of that ruling. But clearly, there's disagreement about whether the court got it right factually. I'm trying to figure out how to distinguish that situation from what's different about the revenue ruling in place here that demonstrates that the tribes have agreed to live by this and it will remain in place.
Attorney Conway, do you have a response?
Yes. So on the Second Circuit ruling, I guess the distinction between, the way I would see it, the distinction between those is that was one set of facts that was before the Second Circuit on lease slot machines. As we've heard ad nauseum probably in this, it's a very facts intensive balancing test. There could be a case tomorrow that brings up another set of facts that could go through the court, and maybe they'd say, yeah, the Second Circuit governs that, or maybe they say, you know what, it's a little different. These facts are different than that, and it doesn't govern it. As the revenue ruling is something that, it is the Department of Revenue Services ruling that this is the way that they're, it's their statement that this is the way we see it. If you guys disagree with that, I'm assuming we'd have to go to them and say, hey, we're no longer going to collect this tax and this is why. That just hasn't happened because we all came to this agreement originally, and it was based on some of the same, you'll see in the revenue ruling, they talk about the balancing test. But the factors are very different in the sales and use tax versus a property tax case versus an income tax case. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think with the Second Circuit, it could be different tomorrow. If we came across a situation and decided, you know what, we just don't think that the facts are the same as the Second Circuit, and we're going to bring another lawsuit, we could certainly do that. That's one of the reasons we thought that a legislative solution would eliminate that. And that's frankly one of the reasons the Department of Revenue Services entered that revenue ruling, was because they wanted to avoid litigation on every one of these cases that may be a little different. So.
And I think that supports, well, it illustrates the observation we make in our recommendations, which is that the federal government, federal courts could still act in this area. Tribes could still bring action in this area to change it. Whatever actions we take as a state could create a precedent. Certainly it's a political precedent for involving other taxes. So I agree that there's a ruling that settles the issue for now. but the issue is not settled for all time. So every act we take moves the ball one way or another. And my recommendation is that we simply hold with the status quo for now. Senator Austin.
Thank you. And I wanted to go back to Representative Horn's conversation relative to the court ruling. We as a legislature often take up cases that we disagree with the courts on. The courts are not, they don't write policy. They make decisions that they wish to opine upon. And most recently, they opined upon something that the Congress had never felt it necessary to set into policy when they talked about abortion. And we as a legislature have codified what we believe is the right tact on that issue. And many states are doing that across this country on a local level. So not everything has to be done by Congress. As a matter of fact, quite frankly, very little happens in Congress relative to difficult discussions in at least in the recent past. And so I think that to say that a court made a decision and that's what we live with, I think that the legislature has a reason to opine on issues. Thank you.
Representative Nuccio.
So I just. This here, it seems to me as what, oh, sorry, brain's not here. Conley was saying, Conway, sorry, they're different. We're looking at different sets of taxes, right? So are your recommendations to kind of stay where we are right now are more in regard to the taxes that the state is seeing from a revenue perspective? Because I see a lot of this also more entrenched in the personal property tax, which is not part of state revenue.
Right, but the what's being asked for here and what was made clear from the town's perspective is if we were to extend this local tax break, the state would have to make it up to those towns. It would require an expenditure from the state coffers to make those towns whole.
Okay, all right, that's what I just wanted to get clarified. Thank you.
Other questions?
I don't want to get too legalistic here, but I want to be clear what I was trying to ask here. As Senator Austin just said, certainly legislature steps in, state legislatures, the Congress, everybody steps in to correct what we have the capacity to step in and correct what we conceive to be not correct federal rulings. My question was more trying to come to terms with what is the sort of consent, like today we have agreement on, today we're here to talk about, specific taxes, municipal taxes. We appear to have agreement on not expanding that to sales taxes, for example. But I'm just trying to figure out how I actually can see that agreement other than just an indication of people's position today. And you might change it tomorrow because it, again, that's policy. We can change policy. So I'm just trying to get a sense of the durability of that and whether, what might happen in the future.
Yeah. If I could, I would just say that, it's actually, and I can certainly send it to you. It is in writing. It's very clear what the Department of Revenue drafted and did. And it's really the Department of Revenue that would change it. It's not like the tribes can't change that Department of Revenue Services ruling. It is their ruling. And, we have been under that ruling for 22 years. So I hear what you're saying, but I don't think there's anything that the tribes could do other than say, I guess we could say, well, we disagree with it. But that's not what we've done for 22 years. And that's not what we're saying today.
Mr. Pennell.
From an historical perspective, we were part of creating that ruling. So that was a position on at least the behalf of Mohegan that we were part of. Yes, things can change. Obviously, that's why we're here, because we're talking about change. But it did not come out of the blue and just get dropped on the tribes back these 20 years ago.
Senator Austin.
Attorney Conway, when you send that over, could you just send it to Susan Keene so that all of us could get a copy of that? Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Roberts,
just-
Attorney
ju-
Roberts, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just one small point to make for the record in terms of the recommendation you forwarded is it provides in there in an opening paragraph about tribes are not subject to real or personal property on their reservation lands. And I just wanted to make sure, clarify that as a matter of federal law, we are subject because Congress has ratified the Montville Agreement. And so we are effectively paying anything over 700 acres, real or personal property. So just
We'll add that correction to our draft. That additional information. Other questions or comments about OPM's draft recommendations? Senator Austin, I believe you had an offering. Would you like to?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I put in recommendations that I had put in the PowerPoint that I had done. And in the PowerPoint, I say that we should have passage of an exemption for non-tribal businesses operating on trust land. Based on the fact that both tribal nations provide the services for the businesses that are on their lands, and the services do not come from the towns of Ledyard or Montville. We should allow we shouldn't allow the continuing taxation of non-tribal businesses. Passage of an exemption on such as this treats each tribal nation equally. I would also say that passage of an exemption for non-tribal businesses would result in a revenue reduction of between 500 and 700,000 for both Montville and Ledyard. And I would recommend that we hold them harmless with funds from the MMPF, the Mashantucket Mohegan Pequot Fund, so that they would not suffer any lost revenue, which is about 0.38% of a mil in Montville and a 0.49% of a mil in Ledyard. I still think that there needs to be a discussion as to why Montville is taxing motor vehicles on Mohegan tribal lands. I can't find any substantiation of that taxation. And relative to the Mohegan settlement agreements, Connecticut should remove section 1F in the agreement between Mohegan and the state. That sets up that doesn't cost either side anything, but we should not be recommending taxation on tribal lands of tribal lands or of I think it's a direct hit on what is termed sovereignty. And so I think that needs to go away. And I also think that there should be discussions between Mohegan and Montville. And I think those discussions should be just around this issue, not casual meetings, but to have real discussions to see if there could become an agreement between Montville and Mohegan. And that would be my recommendation.
Questions or comments about Senator Austin's recommendation? Representative Nuccio.
Thank you, Senator. On your recommendations here, I'm so sorry. I keep forgetting that stupid button. Thank you. On your recommendations here for the reduction, the 500 and 700,000, are those numbers perceived then to stay static? Or will there be any fluctuation in those numbers going forward?
Thank you for that question. No.
No, which one?
There would be no change in
They'd be
the,
static.
they'd be static numbers. There would not be recommendation. The economic development that happens on both tribal nations is done by the tribal nations. They're the ones who pay for the economic development. They're the ones who there is no work by the two towns to increase economic development at the tribal nations. And I think the tribal nations are the ones that do the work and provide the resources. And this would do this. We've made some significant adjustments to both pilot payments for both Montville and and Ledyard. As a matter of fact, Representative Walker and I worked on that in policy in the implementer, which changed it from a 45% to 100% payment to the towns. As a matter of fact, Montville saw a $900,000 increase in their pilot payment as a result of that, and Ledyard saw a $700,000 increase. In addition to that, we as a state used to significantly have increases on MMPF funds, the Mashantucket Mohegan Pequot Fund. And we had over, when we were having significant financial concerns in the state, we decreased what we were paying for that, and we have increased by $500,000, 500,000 for both Montville and Ledyard as host communities, which was always the original intent there. And so we had paid that also. And relative to education, we have increased the ECS for both Montville and Ledyard, most directly for the number of students that they have had increases, and Ledyard gets more than Montville does for ECS, mostly because they have a vocational agricultural school in Ledyard, and they also have a preponderance number of which 88 students come from the reservation, but within the confines of the town of Ledyard, they have probably close to another 70 or 80 students that whose parents live in the town of Ledyard and are paying taxes to the town of Ledyard, but they have increased the number of students they have for ECS.
Follow up?
Just to clarify, so it would require an initial increase, as I understand it, of 1.2 million, but then it would not increase thereafter under your proposal.
That would be correct.
Representative Nuccio.
And I just want to follow up the change in pilot. What year did that occur?
Senator Austin.
I think it was 3 years ago, but it might have been 2. My years are getting conflicted, but I think it was 3 years ago.
And is that still, that increased pilot is still going on? So they're still receiving
Correct.
almost $1 million each on top of
I
on
know,
top of it.
700,000 is not close to $1 million, but
Well, you know,
I know that you have numbers in your brain, and I know that you know that that's not true.
900,000 is though.
But it is, pilot, unlike other funds that are static, a pilot changes. So for example, Montville lost 300,000 this year when they decreased their mill rate. So their mill rate is a calculation that
Right.
goes into pilot funding, and they saw a decrease. And Montville gets significant pilot payments because they also have a prison within the confines of their borders. So when you look at the total funding from for Montville for pilot, about 65%, I don't have the sheet right in front of me right now, but about 65% is related to the reservation, and about 97% is related to the reservation in Ledyard. And that is in the calculations that was in the PowerPoint presentation that I had. So, and when you look at how the land is valued, the land in Montville is valued higher than the land in Ledyard. And I've asked Mr. Heft to a couple of questions relative to how is that calculated, and why is there such a big difference when you look at the number of acres that that Mohegan has and the number of acres that Mashantucket has. Pennies on the dollar, there's a huge discrepancy between what Ledyard gets and what Montville gets. That was also the same thing when I was trying to figure out how pilot is paid on prisons, and the prisons in Summers were receiving, Summers was receiving from pilot relative to the prisons much more than Montville was receiving for their prison in Montville. So I'm really very much interested in getting down to into the nitty gritty of how pilot is calculated.
Thank you.
Representative Cheeseman.
Oh, good here. Still on.
Thank you. And I'm not sure if this is a question for Senator Alston or for the Mohegans. So I understand that the $500,000 payment to Montville would be to cover the agreement that they have to pay them $500,000 each year. But my understanding in the initial tribal recognition agreement was that were they to acquire more than 700 acres and take that into reservation land, that everything that was non-tribally owned would then be subject to property tax. How would this agreement remove that requirement? And particularly if that is part of their federal agreement, as opposed to simply an agreement with the state?
Are you talking about
Your proposal.
my proposal does not touch the Montville agreement at all. It requires more of a discussion to happen between Montville and Mohegan on a formal basis, directly reflective of their agreement. That's all it does. It does not change it at all.
And I understand that the desire is to separate these two, but certainly from perhaps not my point of view, but there is a point of view that these are intertwined and that a decision with regard to how local property tax is administered by the towns on its face affects both towns in a disparate way. So my question is, absent an agreement, even if Montville and the Mohegan tribe agreed to have a discussion, could two parties unilaterally dissolve an agreement that was part of the state and
That's
federal
fine.
recognition of the tribe?
Stop trying to take
Senator
away.
Alston.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. He's trying.
So
Again, we're just talking about my agreement right now, my proposal, and in my proposal, we are not, I don't perceive them as intertwined.
All right, so
and
that simply,
this is my,
this is simply addresses that annual $500,000.
no, it doesn't touch that at all. It doesn't touch that at all.
so
That 500,000 is part of the Montville agreement, and
Right.
so it doesn't touch that at all. And then that's what I'm saying. That doesn't, neither of them get touched. Now, I'm not saying I agree with the Montville agreement either.
Yeah, right.
It's this, wait a minute, you guys. are
Let's
talking.
have one chat here.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to answer a question, so
I have one microphone and I'm just one man.
And he's fighting for it.
just trying to get me to stop talking
So,
about my
so this
proposal.
is to replace the 500,000 that is sent every year to Montville?
No,
No.
it has
Alright.
nothing
Then I
to
am
do with that.
thicker than
Senator-
two short planks
Senator-
today.
If I could,
Let me try. Can I take a shot? I'm going to take a shot.
Exactly.
This is simply to compensate Montville for the exemption of the personal property tax
correct.
on the reservation land in
Correct.
Oh,
Montville.
right, the existing.
Right. So
the
they'd be
let's
losing
say-
tax revenue from the non-tribal
Got it.
folks. This would be reimbursing them for that.
It's just, it's simply a coincidence that the two numbers are identical.
Exactly. Well, one is 553,000 and one is 554,000. And so they're completely different. And the 500,000, unlike Representative Nuccio, who tried to compare,
This says 700.
no, I know what I said. I know. Hey, listen, I can always ask for more for my town, so,
Says it.
no, it doesn't. It does. It says 500 to 700,000. Because we have to figure out the Montville 90,000 on motor vehicles.
I think Representative Cheeseman got her question answered.
Yes.
Any
thank
other
you.
questions, comments about Senator Austin's
I
proposal?
believe.
so
Attorney Roberts.
I'd just like to just answer a little bit more on Representative Cheeseman's question, and that is, while it is true, if the legislature were to pass Senator Austin's bill with regard to non-Indian personal property taxes on everything up to 700 acres, right, we wouldn't make those payments. But our concern is that it does not address everything over 700 acres, where our agreement provides for the tribe to pay personal property taxes on its trust lands over 700 acres. And there's an open question, and that's why we're concerned about potential litigation. Let's say acre 701, we lease it to Walmart. Does Walmart have to pay personal property taxes or not under the Montville agreement? And that's where we could lead into litigation. So I just wanted to clarify.
And I think that was the point, even though I was confused by the numbers, that was my concern, and that perceived overlap, regardless of what this is doing is, but I accept Senator Austin's assertion that this does not address in any way the Montville agreement. Thank you.
That's
Senator
all I
Austin.
was gonna say.
Okay. Other questions, comments about Senator Austin's proposal? Do we want to move on to the Mashantucket Pequot recommendations? And if so, Attorney Cummings is gonna summarize those.
Thank you. So basically our primary recommendation really parrots what we talked about in the last meeting. One, we've proposed a very narrow exemption be included in state law that would provide for an exemption for non-Indian personal property located on tribal trust land. Two, there would be a $600,000 payment to each town, Ledyard and Montville, for the next 3 years. And three, the state would facilitate discussions between Mohegan and the town of Montville concerning the pilot obligations under the 1994 settlement agreement. We think that proposal benefits both tribes in the same exact way. We do not see any risk of litigation arising out of the agreement between Montville and Mohegan concerning non-Indian owned personal property located on Mohegan trust land, whether that's now or whether that's once they exceed 700 acres in trust. The language of the agreement between the town of Montville and the Mohegan tribe simply does not support that reading. So that's kind of our primary recommendation. One thing I'd point out right in the middle of our relatively long set of recommendations relative to what everyone else submitted was that we did include a chart on page 3 concerning the expenses, the alleged expenses that Ledyard has raised, its education deficit, and then also policing expenses deficit that they say arises from the reservation from children who are residents of the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation, and then increased policing that they say they started in 2015. When you take those two alleged deficits and then add up the pilot payments that Ledyard receives for Pequot Trust Land, the funding they receive from the Mashantucket Pequot Mohegan Fund, and then property taxes just for the Two Trees Hotel that the Mashantucket Pequots own and operate, which is located on fee land in Ledyard. When you just put those numbers together, that results in over $500,000 of surplus to Ledyard every year. So not even counting the amount of tax revenue they receive for the taxes that they assess on non-Indian personal property that's located on tribal trust land. The last thing I'd point out is that we did include an alternative recommendation, really coming out of some of the discussion last time about other potential solutions here that would possibly provide for a compacting provision that could be enacted into state law wherein the legislature would provide, perhaps DRS or perhaps the governor's office, the authority to enter into compacts with the tribes concerning taxation. And it could range on a whole matter of subjects. And we bulleted out various topics that such a compact could include. And that would really allow the state to kind of come to some kind of customized, if you will, solution with each tribe, given each tribe kind of has its own issues, as we've seen demonstrated throughout these discussions. So that's a quick run through of our proposal. The one other thing that I'd just like to raise, one thing that Larry said earlier about some tweak in your recommendations, Mr. Secretary, and concerning whether there are actually taxes on tribally owned property that's located on the reservation. And so it's just kind of a technical point, but I would just want to make clear that is pilot, not tax, right? So and that results from an agreement, not certainly the agreement was ratified by Congress, and so by operation of law, it's in effect. But just want to be clear that that resulted from an agreement, not because there's authority to tax. The result is the same in terms of the amount of money, but it's important to recognize we're talking about what was agreed to, not what was imposed.
Noted. Can I ask you about your alternative recommendation? You say that the General Assembly could empower the executive branch to negotiate with the tribes for a tax agreement. Could that agreement provide that the tribal nation make the town whole for the tax loss?
I think it would depend, on I guess what the terms are, and I think there would have to be discussion around, can you actually prove up that there are costs that the tribes are creating that would result in some loss that needs to be compensated for? So, certainly I think that's something parties could agree to, but whether there's actually a need to make the town whole, I think that's really the critical question.
Questions or comments about the Mashantucket Pequot recommendations? Representative Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple questions. One, where to begin? I have one question about something in your proposal that I've heard you say before, that if it were about money, the Pequot tribe would have come to an agreement with the other impacted stakeholders long ago. Could you flesh that out for me? I don't quite. It's on page 2 of your recommendations, the very top of the page. We've discussed it before in this room, but I just wonder what that means.
Yeah, I think what
Attorney
that,
Cummings.
yeah, sorry, thank you. I think what that means to us is that, really our solution is about removing the authority of a town to reach into tribal lands, right? And state law recognizing that a town does not have jurisdiction to do what they are doing right now, right? So if this was about a deal whereby you're essentially crediting the tribes against amounts they might be paying under their gaming agreements, right, for taxes that were being imposed by the towns next door. That is a possible solution. That's one in which the towns are continuing to impose their authority. We're not willing to agree to that, because that continues to essentially allow the towns to reach in. We're looking for a solution that recognizes the tribe's sovereignty and their jurisdiction to the exclusion of other governments.
I understand the principle of what you're trying to achieve here. That's
Yeah.
that's quite clear and well articulated here. I guess what I don't understand is what a simple solution, if it were just about money, would look like. How would you have just agreed to pay the town? If you're saying you could have resolved it if it were just about money,
Yeah.
what would that, if it were just about, what is that simple agreement that you're saying you could have reached?
So I think that's what's there. What the idea of that is some solution in which there is a credit. So take, for example, what Mohegan has put on the table, and I'll let them speak specifically to what they've proposed. But as I read their recommendation, it's one in which it's possible for the adjacent towns to continue taxing, right? And so if we were agreeable to that, both tribes being agreed with such an approach, and if there was the political will within the legislature to pass that, that's a solution that could have gone forward.
I guess
So,
that's my point,
yeah.
because that is that's maybe a position that the tribes could have agreed to, but that has a revenue impact on the state that is not so simple that we would just, that agreement would have been reached if it had just been about, handing money over. There is
Sure.
significant revenue impact here.
Mhm.
So I guess I don't see how that could have happened even if it were about money.
Yeah.
All of this is still open, but.
Right. But that, I think ultimately though, our view is it really is about recognizing that, both tribes should have
I
the
understand.
authority to have jurisdiction without the neighboring municipalities reaching into their
I understand. That makes
their
sense. Thanks.
jurisdictions.
And then sticking to the 2-question.
Representative
protocol
Horn.
We've established. I had a quick question about your alternative recommendation and, I guess I had a little moment of PTSD. Does this implicate gaming?
No, it did not, not in it.
Just want to be
that,
clear.
that was the, I mean, yeah.
I did.
I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but you know, certainly as we've talked about that was the furthest thing from my mind when we were thinking about, the
Yeah.
possible solution.
Just wanted to make sure, because I mean, I know
But-
that we use, and we've said this before, because you are sovereign nations, we do use a lot of euphemisms here about whether
Yeah.
what is a tax and what isn't a tax and what's just
Sure.
a payment. And,
Yeah.
and so I read this and thinking this could apply to the gaming compacts quite
Yeah.
easily, which I imagine that not
But-
anyone's
but, you know,
interested in
I'm-
reopening and
But you know,
renegotiating.
cannabis is another place
Yeah.
where we've used a compacting mechanism, right? Included that into law. So it's, you know, it's not like a gaming thing only.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Horn, it's been my experience that you never know where a negotiation is going to land once you get into it. So you're absolutely right. Once you start talking, many things are possible. I see Mayor Allen from Ledyard had his hand up. Are you still have a question, sir?
Yes, thank you, sir. Just a comment. I'm a little bit concerned about implying the use of the Pequot Fund money in terms of making the town whole. I think that's an kind of an unfair statement because all 169 municipalities receive the benefit of the Pequot Fund, but not all 169 municipalities have costs directly associated with it too. So I just want to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Other questions or comments concerning the Mashantucket? Representative Cheeseman.
And again, my question has to do with your alternative recommendations. So legislation that would authorize the governor is designee to enter into a tax agreement with any federally recognized Indian tribe. Does this present the possibility that you yourselves would be collecting sales tax and or income tax? It does not specify what kind of tax is concerned. I would see, given the discussions with Secretary Beckham, it appears that it would open that possibility.
You know,
Attorney Cummings.
yeah, thank you. You know, one thing I could see out of this, Representative Cheeseman, is that that understanding that we have with DRS now and in that revenue ruling from 20 plus years ago, you could see those terms that we've been operating by for 2 decades now incorporated into a document like this. And so it's something obviously we've agreed to. It's been working well, and could easily be included. What's here, it's kind of wide open in terms of what the parties could agree to on the subject matter.
I mean, you could also limit it. Like if the legislature says, yeah, we're not comfortable going there for income tax or sales tax, but we want to resolve this property tax, but we've got 2 tribes with very different situations. It's your legislation. So you could certainly say, and I've seen this in different jurisdictions where some will say, this is just for sales and use tax. This is just for income tax. This is just, or you could say, this is just, we're giving that authority just for property taxes. And you put the limits on that you think are important to that. Whether you have to pay for it, like, that's one of the terms. So, so I think it could go either way.
So just wearing my finance, revenue and bonding
Yes.
hat with
Yes.
jurisdiction over taxation, I would hate to read that as nice agreement you've got here. Shame if anything happened to it. Anyway, and I just a comment. I do think it's very important as we go forward. I see both mayors of Ledyard and Montville on this, that we acknowledge their interest in this. That's representing one of the 2 towns. I would hate to think we as a legislature, although I know we do it all the time, and perhaps this is my parochial interest, that we would be making a decision that might have such a long-standing impact on these 2 towns without seeking and making it at least a good faith effort to get their input and ideally their agreement with this going forward. So that's it for me for the time being. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Austin.
Actually, don't have a question. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what Mayor Allen was talking about, the MMPF fund, the Mashantucket Mohegan Pequot Fund. And the fact is that host communities and those that were impacted by the reservations were given top priority in the MMPF fund. That is actually part of the formula that is used for the MMPF fund. So this more properly fits if we ever get something done, it more properly fits under the MMPF fund, even though other towns do get funding out of that. The other towns got funding historically on a much larger basis just to spread the wealth around. And they were on the lower tier of getting funding through the MMPF fund. And so I just wanted to let you know, Mayor, that it just more properly fits in under this. And as a matter of fact, much to the Secretary's chagrin, and I think he sought to veto a bill that I put in that was approved 100% by the legislature, 100% by the Appropriations Committee, 100% by the legislature in both the House and the Senate, to return to what we were at before Governor Rowell and Governor Malloy all decreased the amount that was going out to towns. So I will continue to seek restoration to that fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. It was outside the biennium. We don't do budgets 3 years in advance, so that's why we didn't do that one. Representative Nuccio.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to go over one point in your recommendations. You have on here, provide annual payments to the town of Ledger and Montville from the fund of 600,000 each for 3 years. A, how did you come up with the 600,000? And B, can you talk a little bit about the 3-year limitation on it?
Attorney
Yeah.
Cummings.
So those numbers are approximately what each town is receiving right now based on what we know in personal property tax from non-Indian vendors and tenants who are on tribal trust land. And, certainly if the, if the legislature sought fit to expand that past 3 years or, make it less than 3 years, that's, within your discretion. I think, we just saw that as a reasonable window to basically phase out that funding over time, but there's no other magic to it.
Thank you.
Mr. Attorney Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just a couple of points. I know this committee has spent a lot of time around this issue. I just want to, unfortunately, I do have to take issue with the agreed to, not impose characterization. It wasn't agreed to, it was imposed. And I think I'm not going to go through that history today. The second point is that there are a whole bunch of federal land claim settlements out there that people refer to as restrictive settlement acts. And so the notion that all of those tribes agreed to those types of agreements as opposed to whether they were imposed, I think is a little antiquated. Our agreement does provide payment in lieu of taxes, but it does provide dollar for dollar. So you can, call it a payment in lieu of taxes or a tax, but it's effectively a tax because it is dollar for dollar. In terms of litigation risk, I know that that's something that Mr. Cummings raised again, that they see no litigation risk. There is always litigation risk, and I guess what I would share with you all is that we've spent a lot of time over the preceding months talking about a wrongly decided court decision, the Second Circuit decision. That was a unanimous decision. And so I think that there is always litigation risk out there. And finally, with regard to exercising sovereignty, and our Chief of Staff, Mr. Bunnell, will talk about this, but we've put forward a proposal that is recognizing the sovereignty of both tribes, and tribes can exercise their sovereignty in different ways to meet their needs for their communities.
Thank you, sir. Other questions, comments on the Mashantucket Pequot recommendations? Hearing none.
Yeah, Lenny Bonnell from Montville.
Yes, Mayor Bennell, go ahead.
Well, being a new kid on the block here, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the entire issue here. However, in reading the former mayor from Montville's letter of objecting to the exemption, I just want to reiterate some of his points here. That remember that the state urged the Mohegan tribe to enter into an agreement with Montville to avoid litigation and to provide a tremendous source of funding to the state. We can't ignore that fact. This agreement was approved by Congress and trumping the state statute. The agreement committed the Mohegan tribe to an annual payment of $500,000 as a gesture to the tribe's partnership with the town, and committed to payments in lieu of taxes for land outside the land reservation and personal property taxes with limited exclusions. So it kind of, it wasn't just the $500,000 that Montville was going to get for being severely impacted, and which we are severely impacted. It also went beyond the $500,000 to permit us to tax the properties from within on private and non-Indian property. And as far as us being severely impacted, prior to 94, this is just an example. Prior to 94, the police department had, I think there was 9 police officers, and we're up to 30 now. And you can take it to the bank that increase in police services was directly related to the impact from the casinos. I think that, and I'm just using that as an example. That's not the issue. The general government, Board of Education, public works, all those things are severely impacted, and that's why we want to keep things the way they are. If you try to make it up in Pequot funds, that can be changed, whereas this can't be changed because it's already been tried to and they've been upheld by past court decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Representative Nuccio, did you have?
Yeah, thank you. I just have a quick question on what you said, because this is the first time that I'd heard that. In the agreement, you're saying that it specifically allows the towns to charge personal property taxes?
It's been ruled by the courts that they have been allowed.
Okay, do we have that written anywhere?
I can provide some information on that. Yeah, I don't have it in front of me here now, though. I'm going by information that's been forwarded to me from the previous mayor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions or comments? We have recommendations from the Mohegan Tribal Nation as well. Is that Mr. Bennell or Mr. Attorney Roberts?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay. So our proposal is in the form of a bill. And essentially, we think that this is an approach that satisfies the goals for both tribes. And that is, one, it makes very clear that real and personal property located on land held in trusts is exempt from taxation as a matter of state law. And that is essentially in lines with what has been proposed as a matter of sovereignty, that those lands not be subject to taxation. Subsection B essentially takes into account Mohegan's unique situation where we have the Montville Agreement, and that we would receive a credit for any dollar for dollar credit based on payments made to Montville for real or personal property as required under the agreement. And so, I understand when we've talked about this in earlier presentations that there are concerns fiscally and how that impacts the state. Certainly appreciate that, but this is a matter of providing a equal level playing field for both tribes and treating both tribes in a similar outcome, taking into account their unique circumstances.
Mr. Bennell.
So the tribal council met over the weekend and also asked that I read something into the record. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. We want to take this opportunity to thank the members of this working group and the staff for all of their hard work over these past few months. On behalf of the Mohegan Tribe, we want to express our gratitude for the amount of time and effort that everyone has put into this important issue. The Mohegan Tribe has a long history of working collaboratively with their neighbors, local governments, state governments, and the federal government. We have been directed by our elected official leaders to take every step possible to do the same here today. We sincerely hope that this working group can find a consensus to move forward, because we believe that the legislature should respect the ideas of everyone, particularly a fellow government. If a consensus cannot be found, we would ask that we take no action, but please to simply share the information that has been gathered, which would respect the views of all members. This working group was charged with addressing the issue for both federally recognized Native American tribes. Therefore, the only fair path would be to not place one tribe's interests above another. The issue of dual taxation is important. Mohegan tribal leaders have spoken out in support of addressing dual taxation in Connecticut and elsewhere, but that must be premised on the fact that the corrective action is implemented fairly for all involved and does not cause more disparity. We all know there is a long history of theft of native lands, a breaking of treaties, and forcing tribes into agreements that are not in their best interest. Both tribes represented here can attest to that. The fact that the state has taken the time to explore these issues in an open and transparent forum with the goal of correcting some of that mistreatment of tribes says a lot about the state of Connecticut. Before us today are effectively 3 or 4 proposals. We understand and respect the proposal made by the secretary, you, sir. These are difficult budget times, and your position from a fiscal standpoint dictate a conservative approach requiring additional study to fairly achieve the goals of addressing dual taxation. The proposal that has been put forward by Senator Austin and also by the Mashantucket Pequots, addressing the dual taxation issue for the Mashantucket Pequots, while ignoring the challenges that were forced upon the Mohegan tribe by the state when the Mohegan tribe was working to settle their land claims. Therefore, however well-intentioned those proposals may be, the Mohegan Tribal Council rejects the assertion that those proposals are good for their people. We support addressing this flaw in our taxation system, but only if it is a state policy enacted with parity for all Native American tribal nations being impacted. If recommended to the Connecticut General Assembly or adopted by them, this proposal will cause additional harm, which in effect will run counter to the goals of the work of this systematic unfairness. The proposal Mohegan has before you is fair, fiscally responsible, and puts both tribes on a level playing field and hears the concerns of both nations. The best solution that does no harm is one that addresses the concerns of both tribes on the topic of dual taxation. We remain committed to continue to work toward such an agreement. Our team has been tasked by our tribal leaders to work with all parties willing to recognize the importance of equity amongst all tribes. We must make clear, though, and continue to reiterate that the state should not enact any proposal that satisfies one tribe's concerns while ignoring and further perpetuating a historic wrong placed upon another tribe on the very same issue of taxation. Both tribes must and should agree. Thank you for your time and trust that we can continue to work collaboratively, listen to all government's interests, and chart a fair and equitable solution. We remain committed to staying at the table as long as that takes. That
Thank
was
you.
adopted and voted on by the council yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions or comments concerning the Mohegan Tribal Nations recommendation? Attorney Conway.
Just one clarification on the proposal for taxation of non-Indian property. Is that under your proposal only if it is pursuant to your agreements that there ends up being a tax? Or is it you would allow, because your first part says nothing's taxable, right? It says it's tax exempt. And then the second part, it looks like there still could be some taxation on non-Indian property. So what I was trying to figure out was, is that like what you're saying is you think that's a possibility under your agreements. Is that to account for that only? Where you would still have non-Indian property that's taxable and then you get a credit for that? I'm trying to understand that
If
part of
there-
it.
Yeah, if there is non-Indian personal property that is taxable on the reservation, and we wouldn't want to seek litigation if we're making those payments, or the local, or the non-Indians are making those payments, we would like to see a credit for those payments.
But does that mean, because the first part exempts it, right? The first part of your proposal
Correct.
says that nothing can be taxed
Right.
on reservation by the towns.
But we have
But you have the
agreements.
agreement, which you're saying you think could suggest that there's taxation of non-Indian property as well as tribal. So you're saying only if there's taxation under that theory, would you then get the credit on the second part of that?
If you're asking, would we have to litigate? No, we would not have to litigate. We would want, if our non-Indian entities made those payments, let's go back to my Walmart example. We
Right.
would take a credit for those payments.
So, and that's assuming that the town says, look, it's great that the state enacted this exemption, but we think under Mohegan agreements, we have the right to tax still. Is that how that tax even
If they
comes
would
about?
say that, then we would want an offset for those as well.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to understand, because your first part says there's no tax,
Mhm.
and then it looks like there is still a tax
There
on
is.
non-Indian.
By taking, yeah, it takes into account. the money.
It's so it's the agreement. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask it a different way? What this says is, going forward, there'd be no taxation, including of the non-tribal folks on Mohegan Reservation. But that pursuant to your agreement, the tax you're paying to the town, the state would have to simply give you a credit against what's due under, say, the compact. So the state revenue would be making up what the town is getting from you.
That's correct.
I'm good. Attorney Cummings?
It's just one other point of clarification, Larry, what's for the non-Indian entities that are paying tax in that circumstance, what's the basis for the tribe getting the credit there?
I think it's quite simply just fairness and equity, right? Because presumably if Mashantucket doesn't have this exemption or has this exemption in place, Mashantucket can decide to impose a personal property tax if they wanted to on the non-Indians, right? And
Right.
so this is a situation where our non-Indians would be paying those personal property taxes. And so we should get a credit for those because those are lost tax revenues that the tribe would have otherwise received or could otherwise have received. I guess I should put it that way.
Yeah.
I think Representative Horn has a question. Mr. Secretary.
Representative Horn.
Following up on Attorney Conway's questions, and I don't mean to put the, I have a question for the mayor of Montville. And I'm going to preemptively give you the ability to not answer this question if you don't feel quite ready. But is it your position that the Montville agreement permits the town of Montville to tax / continue taxing non-tribal property located on tribal lands? And this is a very compound question, I'm sorry. Both on the 700 acres and beyond, should that exceed the 700 acre limitation? Has the town taken a legal position on that?
Mayor Benelli, if
I-
you care to answer, you can.
Keep in mind, he's only been mayor since.
I know, my apologies.
That's right. I'm not,
Repeating the question clearly, so.
I'm not totally familiar with the language in the compact. However, I can tell you that when I say the courts have upheld the right of local governments to tax non-native, the Mashantucket tribe lost 2 cases that affirm this fact. They lost their claim for tax immunity on appeal in 2003, and the state Supreme Court ruled in favor of Legend in 21 to force the Pequots to reimburse legal fees for the town after the town was successful in defending their right to tax non-native personal property. So what they used as their argument, I will find out. and I'll advise further. But it's clear that the courts have already ruled in favor of the towns being able to levy tax on non-tribal property.
Representative
I
Warren?
presume that is essentially is the Second Circuit decision that we're talking about that has done the balancing test here. Which
Attorney
we
Attorney
would
Conway
be
seems
in-
to have an
sorry,
angle on
go
this
ahead.
question.
Yeah, I would just say that the Second Circuit case was based on state law at the time, which didn't say anything about this. So if the state enacted a law saying municipalities, you are not able to tax on reservation, there would be no Second Circuit decision. That is state law, that it would be. What Mohegan's situation is with Montville is that they have an agreement that's been ratified by federal law. And that's what they've been pointing out in these proceedings. They believe that could possibly apply to non-Indian property. We've been saying, gee, we don't see it in the agreements. They're saying they're concerned about litigation there. And so that's a very different situation from the Second Circuit situation where the state law didn't provide one way or the other on exemption. It just said that municipalities have the right to tax personal property. And the whole question before the Second Circuit was whether the federal law allowed that or not.
Questions? Representative Walker?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I want to thank everybody today and for the last 4 months that we've been working on trying to understand and get a balance on what's going on with taxing properties of sovereign nations, having the ability to gain some of the finances that have been achieved by those locations, also by property and who owns the property and what is the actual fairness in that. And the one thing that I've learned more than anything is that we have multiple interpretations, which makes it even more complex, because I feel that one thing we want is fairness for everybody. One thing we want is opportunities for people to thrive in their communities. Because most of the testimonies that we've had, there's always a contradiction from one or another. And I feel that I appreciate Mohegan's attempt to try and come up with a solution. And I appreciate Mashantucket for trying to come up with a solution. And I appreciate my co-chair for trying to come up with a solution. I don't think we've got a solution yet. I don't think we are able to do that because we are talking about two different types of issues that have to be addressed. And I want to make sure also that we also realize, as Mr. Secretary has pointed out, we have a financial situation in front of us that can impact other people. So when we start shifting dollars around, it's going to have an impact on other people that may not be here at the table represented. So I worry about coming to a quick solution. I do know that laws can be changed. That's what we are here for. We can change the way we tax. We can change the way we define ownership. And that's something that all of us have to be on board with. I think Mr. Secretary came up with the best solution. I think we need to continue this conversation. I don't want to stop the conversation, but I want to make sure that as we quote different legal findings and different things, that I have it in front of me. Sometimes my interpretation might be a little different than others, but I want to make sure that I have the accurate interpretation for me to be able to really say, I totally support this, or I totally disagree with this. And each time I learn more and more, and I appreciate this. I learn so much from all of you. I think it's amazing. But I also want to make sure that it's going to give representation for everybody. So in Mr. Secretary's statement, he had a recommendation of his own, which was at the very bottom. He recommended continued study and coordination with the tribes and the federal government He said, we cannot we recommend that the General Assembly continue the study, the issue, and coordinate with federal and tribal leaders to explore options that minimize any state revenue loss or additional expenditures by the state. And I think that's probably right now the safest recommendation, because I don't want to cause harm to anybody more so than trying to make sure that appropriately we are going forward. So with that, I move that that recommendation be voted on in this group.
And I'll second the motion.
Okay, we didn't have a vote teed up on the agenda, but I'm happy to bend to the will of the body, however. How about this? Can I take the motion and second to be that we vote on recommendations? Is that what we want to do? Or are we done discussing them? Okay, I'm not getting a warm fuzzy from the group here. So how about we withdraw that? Okay. Any other? I appreciate that.
And
I love closure.
And I like supporting you.
I
Mr.
swear I
Secretary.
didn't talk to her before this meeting, as God is my witness. Okay. Any other questions or comments about the Mohegan Tribal Nations recommendations, which was our last? Would you please?
I can't look. I will withdraw my recommendation. You have to
And
withdraw.
I'll withdraw my seconding of the recommended motion.
Thank you both. Other questions, Representative Cheeseman?
So quick question, under your recommendation, under the recommendation of the Mohegan tribe, the money that would be credited, could it in theory be remitted back to the property owners to in effect make a level playing? Let's say anyone who wants to develop non-tribal entities on a Mashantucket property is now not subject to property tax. Under your agreement, they might be. So and you may never have considered this, but could that then be, if the state repaid you, you remit it to your property owners? So in effect, they're getting the same deal as they would if they developed at Mashantucket. I know this is one of the considerations when we look at revenue sources for municipalities, if they put in a sales tax or something like that. No, the attraction is, or the disincentive is, well, I'm just going to go shop next door. And this may be something that had never occurred to you, but it just came into my
Yeah,
crazy brain.
Attorney Roberts?
it's not something that we've considered as of yet, but it's just trying to make a fair, equal playing field so that when you go to trust lands at Mashantucket and trust lands at Mohegan, it's equalized, basically to take account of the agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Bennell?
I would, first and foremost, the mayor and I are not related.
I did
He's
ask
a wonderful
Senator Austin that
person.
question.
He's a wonderful person, but I saw people asking, we're not related. But in that vein, for Mohegan, we do think it's really important that the town be included in these discussions because we do have these agreements, and very much respect the senator's comments. We respectfully know that without the state at the table, that would be incredibly difficult for us to do. And we think that the state's involvement, the state force these in place. We would like them to be at the table to assist us in whatever we do.
Appreciate that. Senator Berthel.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I didn't want to have us end the meeting without chiming in on what's going on here. And I do align my comments with those made by Representative Walker a few moments ago, having seconded her motion and then withdrawn the seconding. But I think that what we've witnessed now, not only through the course of the work group, but in the last hour and 16 minutes or so, is that there's still a lot of work that can be done to bring solutions that work for all constituents here, both tribal nations, the two towns that are involved, the state of Connecticut. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as the legislative leaders in the room here to take on that work and to get to some point in time where we can have an agreement that is more agreeable to everyone at the table. And I think that's where we're at, Mr. Secretary, at this point in time. There's a lot of questions, and I know we're getting into some minutia on some of the questions here, which is okay. But I think we can have those discussions going forward, perhaps by following your recommendation as we started with at the beginning of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Kind of following along with your recommendation, Mr. Secretary, what if in the report as a part of the appendix, we still included the various recommendations so that a continuation of the study, if it's different players involved or what have you, they can pick up the information that was done by each of the parties and they can see it in the report.
Yes, one thought I had, and there's obviously been some discussions outside this room about this, is that we could produce something that simply included all the recommendations, perhaps in an appendix, as well as presumably the minutes could be attached as well of all of our discussions. They've pretty well summarized what we've talked about. So anyone looking at this a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now would be able to see this is what they found, this is what they thought, regardless of where we wound up with the General Assembly. That's one way we could approach the report. We do have an obligation under the Public Act to produce a report with findings and recommendations, and that's one way we could handle it. Yes, ma'am. Representative Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to propose what I now have concluded is somewhat unrealistic, which is that we work on maybe establishing a set of commonly agreed upon facts. And I recognize now that sounds easier than we all know it is. That said, Mr. Chair, your proposal does at least include some summaries of where we've been and what we've done. And so I wonder whether we could at least focus on that to keep a just very brief, not so that we don't lose. We've all done a lot of work here. As Representative Walker just said, I've learned a lot. And certainly Senator Austin has put a lot of work into this as well. And I wouldn't want to lose that ground. And so having some, and again, I don't want to get into some like 50-page thing that no one's going to read, but something very included amongst whatever recommendation we arrive at, some summary of what we did and the issues we focused on, and then with the recommendations attached, I think might help us gain some ground. Thank you.
Do you think that the submissions that have been made to date satisfy that? If one read them all, it's not 50 pages, it's maybe 10.
For
I'm
those
just
of
trying
us
to
on the
avoid having
task
to do more
force,
work.
yes.
Okay. Senator Austin.
Thank you. And we can put in the links relative to the minutes which are on the appropriations committee. So that because I think it was the good co-chair of finance over there who submitted the legislation, making appropriations the one to do the work. I'm just saying.
And I
that
thank
was
the
on
good
you.
Susan Keene for.
We appreciate that. And so I think that I don't think you can put down any one thing. I don't. Generally speaking, I think that that's what we have to do, is put them all together. There is no way to do just one.
So if we did, I'm happy to sign a generic cover letter that fronts all of these recommendations and perhaps the minutes as well as a report, if you will. And it is what it is. People can read this. What people have said today will be in the last set of minutes. So does that suffice? Or are folks happy enough with that as our outcome? I'm seeing some nods. Up, Representative Martin. I'm sorry, Senator Martin, excuse me.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, first of all, for educating myself and a lot of us on this board. I know I spent some time reading over the last week or so regarding this, and I just want to say, Mr. Chair, I like your recommendations that this is really a federal issue. It's so there are so many variables regarding this issue, in particular the intertwining of the lawsuits that have gone before the courts and what's come out of it. We've heard the balancing test that's been applied to some of these rulings. Some of them have resulted in some states being, I guess, the rulings that have come out of the courts resulting in some states taxes on the 9 non-members in tribal land, while that being okay, but and other times it's the tribes that have won. I guess the issue that I've read continually here in some of these rulings is they look at the legal tax incidence of the burden on who's the tax fall on, the tax burden fall on. And I would like to see that that's part of the discussion if this is going to move forward. I think that's an important issue. Local government or state government, are, the courts have ruled in some incidences that they can tax those non-tribal members and the businesses. But it's this balancing test that has really determined whether or not who should be receiving the tax revenue, I would say. So I think that's an important part of the discussion. And also too is I think part of that discussion is, the agreement that Montville has. I think we can't bifurcate that and only address the non-Indian entity, I'll say. And looking at that, I think we need to look at that agreement, because I think if we don't, it'll be highly unfair that there is a tribe that maybe gets the benefit of not having to, or the not taxing the non-Indian entity. But when you have this agreement that talks about a tax burden not only to the non-Indian entity above 700 acres, but also the Indian tribe as well, I think we have to look at that and ask ourselves, what does that mean? And is there fairness in that? Just wanted to include my comments before you close this meeting here. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Nuccio.
Thank you. I just want to kind of follow up on what Henry was just saying there, because that's where I'm kind of confuddled right now. Is I guess I don't truly understand Mohegan's compact with Montville and why the Pequots don't have something like similar. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, why there's two different compacts and why it seems to be creating this unequal or interpretation of some unequal status. So that's kind of where I'm not quite sure why you guys have a compact with Montville that is different than what you guys might have with Ledyard, and why that would somehow be an unfair advantage.
Yeah, we can talk about.
Attorney Cummings, we could talk about it, or
Well, I think that needs to be included, because
Yeah.
most people, I think that's going to be.
Yeah,
I think it
mean,
is. I think
that,
it was a
that
discussion.
history is very important, and we went through it some during the session, right? During one of the meetings. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it, but to a large extent, it came down to us litigating through all those issues. From our land claim to gaming to ultimately this litigation with the town of Ledyard over whether you could tax the slot machines or not. And then on Mohegan's side, they did enter into an agreement, or two agreements, one with the town, one with the state, that as we read them, largely facilitated, the resolution of many of their issues and opened the door for them to game after they were recognized. And so it was kind of two different approaches as to how, we got here. And, from I think our perspective, where we are today, and the solution that we've proposed, does provide for that level playing field. We exercised our sovereignty to fight along the way and deal with the issues that were in front of us. They exercise their sovereignty to enter into agreements, with the terms that they have. So, that's kind of, where we are now with each tribe kind of choosing a path.
Attorney Roberts.
And so we would be more than happy to meet with you outside of this context, just to share some of that history. But the short version is that when Mohegan received its federal recognition from the Department of the Interior, it was something that they had waited decades for. And so tribal leaders at the time, like the tribe's medicine woman, tribal historian, she said waiting for that decision was like living in the leap, just the unknown. It was incredibly stressful leading up to those to that point. And so when they received that decision from the Department of the Interior, they had I guess they had a choice. I would say they didn't really have a choice, because the state had been fighting Mohegan's recognition all through those decades. And they basically said, if you agree to these terms, I'm oversimplifying it for purposes of time, but Mohegan, if you agree with these terms and you allow the town of Montville to tax your trust lands and to tax your tribal personal property, and arguably, I'm not going to concede that, but also non-tribal personal property over 700 acres, right? We will no longer challenge your recognition. We will no longer hold you up, because you've seen what has happened to other tribes in Connecticut when they've received a federal recognition from the Department of the Interior, only to have it challenged by the state and lose and never become federally recognized. And so I don't interrupt you, Jody, when you're talking. And so we're happy to talk with you and walk you through that history, because some people can say you had a choice. Looking back, I don't think that Mohegan had a choice.
So I understand the high level of that there, right? That's that part. I understand that history of it. As you said, we talked about it, and I think it was the second meeting. We may have talked about it. What I'm looking for is the divergent in that, right? Were the Pequots under the same thing, and then you did something different additionally to change that after? Like, I guess that's because this is the crux of it, right? The crux of it is how Mohegan and
Yeah. So
Attorney
one
Cummings.
point of clarification. My understanding is that the Mohegans had received their federal recognition at the time those agreements were entered, right? There was some right of appeal.
There is a right.
But-
That's
right.
That's exactly.
But they were recognized at the time that those agreements were entered, right? So
I don't know that there was final recognition at that point.
Well, I think
Yeah.
my overarching point here is not to kind of develop
Yeah.
back into meeting two, but I do think that is very relevant that we have a high level understanding of that in this packet, because if this is something we're going to share with other people, they're going to be asking the same sort of question.
I think as part of our appendix, we could include all the submittals that people have made, all the presentations, because it included that information in the Mohegan. Both sides had extensive discussion in their submitted materials at those meetings. We can include that in an appendix as well.
Can OLR go through and distinguish like opinion from interpretation?
They'll do whatever you ask them to do. They work for you.
I'd
Senator Austin.
Thank you. Thank you. So, having been somebody who lived in this area for my whole life, except for when I was in the military, I was not here then, but I lived in Norwich, grew up in Norwich, was familiar with the conversations that were happening about then. Mashantucket decided to sue to get their recognition. Mohegan said, and I'm very much simplifying this, Mohegan said, we're not going to go through all of that. We don't want to do that. And they came up with an agreement. And that agreement was submitted into the public record. And one of the documents that we got from Mohegan today, we have 3 documents from them. 2 of them we already had. 2 of them we had just what they had submitted. So we had, the third one is the public record, which formally recognizes them, that covers both the Montville agreement and the state agreement. And in my proposal, it says that we should get rid of the fact that the state was complicit in the Mohegan problem of 700 acres. And we shouldn't have done that. We should get rid of it now. But Mashantucket spent millions and millions of dollars to fight for their side of the issue. And they really decided a different path. So they have two different paths. Now, the path, there has been some talk here that the path was forced upon Mohegan for them to go along with that. And I think that we have a horrible record in the country for treaties that have never been appropriate. And I feel that the Mohegan agreement is a bad agreement. But the agreement, just on its face, was agreed to by Montville and Mohegan so that Mohegan could get into the gaming world right away. That was part of the reason why that happened. That's in every document that has ever been written about this whole issue. At the same time, we also, to make this even more complicated, we had both the Eastern Pequots, the Schaghticoats, and the Golden Hill Pegussets looking to get federal recognition. They were given federal recognition, and then that federal recognition was taken away from them as a result of Attorney General then Richard Blumenthal fighting their recognition because they said they didn't want any more casinos in the area. But the casinos are not what this has been all about, at least in my mind. It's never been all about that for me. It's been about the tribal nations having a way to support themselves. It's not been about casinos. It's been about tribal nations having a business to support themselves and recognition of the two tribal nations. In order to get recognized, Mashantucket Pequot said, we're going to fight to get recognized because we are not going to settle for an agreement. And Mohegan said, we don't want to fight anymore. We're going to take an agreement that is really shitty. And there is no other way to say it, no politically correct way to say it. It's a really bad agreement. And they felt that that was their only path forward. They took one path forward, they took another path forward. And I think that's essentially where I am on all of this. Sorry for swearing.
It's all right. I've heard worse from you.
I've said worse.
Anyway, so our administrators are getting all that down, or they'll review the tape and produce minutes of this meeting as well. What I was thinking is there'd be perhaps, well, they have a nice summary. It's a nice professional summary. It doesn't necessarily include every word. So I thought I'd produce some kind of a generic cover letter, perhaps with a little table of contents that would include the recommendations as submitted today, the minutes from all the meetings. And then it sounds like there's interest in having all the materials that have been submitted to this body since we've been working as an appendix. So a reader would have the full context of all the discussions as well as all the materials that backed that up. And we could circulate that. My thought is we wouldn't necessarily need to have another meeting unless there was general interest, and I could, if you could trust me to gauge that from your emails or phone calls, and maybe we would that would be our final product without objection.
Sounds good.
All right.
Motion to adjourn?
I've got a motion to adjourn. Is there a second? It's been seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.